So, what if I told you there's a kind of forgotten intellectual tool out there, a sort of lie detector for history? Well, today we're going to explore a powerful and honestly overlooked idea from a classic thinker. This is Paley's other argument, a forgotten test for truth.
And this quote right here, this is the key to the whole thing. The character of truth and originality is undesignedness. Now, what in the world did William Paley mean by that? Well, stick around because that's exactly what we're about to unpack.
Okay, so first, let's set the stage a little. When most people hear the name William Paley, there's usually just one thing that comes to mind. That's right, the famous watchmaker analogy. You've probably heard it. You're walking along, you find a watch on the ground, you see all its intricate parts working together, and you just know it had a designer. You don't assume it just popped into existence. Paley argued the natural world is the same way. Its complexity points to a divine designer. It's a really powerful argument from design. But here's the twist, because Paley came up with another, I'd say equally brilliant argument that pretty much flips that whole idea on its head. It's a test for truth that looks for something else entirely, not the fingerprints of a designer, but the accidental smudges of reality itself. So what problem was he even trying to solve here? Well, Paley was tackling a huge challenge, one that's as old as time. How do you tell a true story from a really, really good fake? How can you possibly spot the difference between authentic history and just a clever forgery? Think about it like this. Let's say you dig up an old history book about some famous general, and then you find a stash of his personal letters. You read them both, and wow, every single event the letters mention lines up perfectly with the history book. That's gotta be proof, right? Case closed. They're both real. Well, here's where Paley throws us a curveball. He argued that this kind of perfect, obvious agreement, it's actually a little suspicious. Instead of being the ultimate proof, it might just be a sign that someone worked really hard to make them match. After all, what's a forger's #1 goal? To create consistency. Paley basically saw 3 ways this could go down. Either the history was written using the letters as a source, or the letters were totally faked based on the history, or maybe both of them were created from some other source that might not even be true itself. You see the common thread here? In every single one of those scenarios, the agreement you're seeing is the result of deliberate, intentional design. Someone is trying to make it all fit together perfectly. It's not natural, it's artificial. And this really shows you the fundamental difference. A forger is manufacturing a story. They're creating these really obvious links, making sure everything is explicitly consistent because they're trying to tell you what to think. But a real eyewitness, they just give you casual details. They make indirect connections. They just let the truth come out on its own. Okay, so if obvious agreement is suspicious, how can we ever really know if a historical account is true? This is where Paley drops his brilliant solution, his test for truth, which he called undesigned coincidences. All right, let's break this down, because this is the absolute heart of the idea. An undesigned coincidence isn't just 2 people saying the same thing. No, it's when you have 2 accounts that have these subtle little details that were clearly not planned, but when you put them together, they just click and suddenly they explain each other. Let me try to put it another way. Imagine you're reading a letter and it just casually mentions that a general had to suddenly change his travel plans. Seems totally random, right? But then, in a completely separate book, you read this really confusing part about why a big battle got delayed. And suddenly, that tiny detail from the letter just clicks into place and makes the confusing part in the history make perfect sense. That is an undesigned coincidence. So what is it that makes these subtle, almost hidden connections so incredibly powerful? Why would Paley say they're even more trustworthy than 2 documents saying the exact same thing? It feels a little backward, doesn't it? Why would we trust a clue we have to dig for more than one that's just sitting right there on the surface? Well, Paley had a fantastic answer for that. See, for Paley, it's simple. Any decent forger knows how to make things agree on the surface. That's forgery 101. But they would never think to create these subtle, roundabout connections that you'd only spot if you were looking really, really closely. Like he says, it's that very indirectness, that subtlety, that gives the evidence its power. A forger is basically putting on a show for you. They're manufacturing evidence, and they want to make absolutely sure you see it. They're practically screaming, "Look, see how consistent this all is? You have to believe it." But an undesigned coincidence, that's totally different. It's a connection that's so subtle, the original authors probably didn't even know it was there. It wasn't put there for anyone to find. It just is there. because both writers were describing the same messy reality from their own perspectives. It's like finding an accidental fingerprint of truth. So what are the signs of a genuine one? Paley actually gives us a little checklist. First, the connection has to be indirect or oblique. It's something you discover, it's not announced to you. The details themselves can be tiny, but the link they forge has to be solid, not flimsy. And maybe most importantly, the whole thing has to feel natural and unforced, not like some puzzle that was built for you to solve. Okay, so this is a super interesting intellectual tool from the 18th century. But what does it have to do with us right now? Why does any of this still matter? Well, for Paley, the original point was a huge one. He used this method like a forensic tool to examine the historical accounts in the New Testament. And he argued that the web of these little coincidences pointed to one thing, not a forgery, but authentic testimony from real people who were actually there. But honestly, the power of Paley's other argument goes way beyond that. At its core, it's a timeless mental model. It gives all of us a framework for figuring out if a story is credible, whether that's in a history book, a news article, or even just something you hear from a friend. It teaches us to look past the perfect story and search for the messy, interlocking details that give away the truth. And that leaves us with a pretty big question, doesn't it? I mean, we live in an age of perfectly curated social media, deep fakes, and polished artificial narratives. In a world that's drowning in design, how do we get better at spotting those accidental, undesigned fingerprints of truth?